Have you ever had to deal with a bully?
Oh, I just slapped you. Are you alright?
I mean, most of us have encountered some kind of bullying, at least in childhood.
What?
But I find that today there are more and more bullies. And they don't always look the way you think they do. But bullies are people who use their power, their authority, their strength, whatever advantage they have, to make you shamefully do, say, or be something that is false, something that is not true to you, something that you don't agree with. And standing up to them is harder than you think it is. And it's an important lesson that children and even adults must learn what it means to stand up for what is right and to oppose bullies. The story in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, has something to teach all of us about bullies, and that's what we're talking about this week. Kindred UMC live show features adults discussing adult topics, occasionally with adult language. It may not be suitable for young viewers. Please use discretion before watching. Hello all, welcome once again to the Kindred UMC pre-recorded live show, coming to you not live but pre-recorded from my front room, aka Kindred Studio A. My name is Chris Hayden. I am the pastor of Kindred UMC.
Hi, I'm Andrew, and I'm the lay leader of Kindred UMC.
Hi, I'm Taylor, and I'm a gay, non-binary exploring candidate.
All of these things are true, and I do miss the randomness. We all actually have things that we say now, but that's okay.
We can make it random.
Next time we do it, we should. Next time, I am guilty of I say the same thing every single time. So.
Yeah, we need you to start giving.
I should start saying something.
My favorite
different.
show is SpongeBob.
Favorite show is SpongeBob.
Yes.
Well, that's.
They watch a lot of SpongeBob.
You know, I finally got in the car with Anne, who is on staff here, and every time I've been in the car with her, because she always has her son, and it's always like Will's on the Bus or Baby Shark or something, and this is he's finally old enough that she was playing like her music, and I was like, Steve Aoki? I would have never guessed. It's like, you learn a lot about, that's how I felt about SpongeBob. SpongeBob,
Yeah,
okay.
my birthday party SpongeBob.
I see. Well, I do remember that.
Yes.
Anywho, we are continuing our journey through Daniel. The book of Daniel is it's a book that was written in the 3rd century BCE when the Assyrians had conquered Israel, but he's telling a story that was 300 years before that when the Babylonians had conquered Israel. And the Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar, had destroyed the temple, and so it was, the story writer is like, hey, we're in a crap time now. Let me tell you about a story of hope when we were in a crap time before, but God was still there and God was still with us. Let's remember that time, and let's remember that God is still with us now. So that's kind of the idea of the book of Daniel. We're going to be reading from chapter 3, which is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And but before we get into that, let me just ask you, have you ever encountered a bully?
Yes.
Great. Let's move on then. So what?
I'm gay, Chris.
Right. All the time, actually. So what? I mean, what's been your experience with bullying, whether from childhood and feel free to kind of expand that into adulthood, because sometimes bullies in adulthood, you wouldn't call them bullies. You would call them like your supervisor or something.
Right. Your dad.
Right. Yeah. Right. But what's been your experience with bullies?
I'm a little feisty if you don't know who I am as a person. So I was always like.
Can confirm.
So like the one I remember from childhood was this girl. She was on my dance team with me, and I remember she would just cause an issue with everybody all the time. Like she was just that kid that was just like blah blah blah, like to everybody all the time. And one time she looked at me and she picked the wrong person because she looked at me and she's like, I'm gonna slap you with this jazz shoe. And I went, go ahead. And my coach walked up at the same time.
You literally turned the cheek.
I did. And she never did it. And then she never messed with me again. So I was always the person that like tried to, like, I wouldn't like combat it with bullying, but I was very much like, okay, like go ahead.
Yeah.
Like Do what you're gonna do.
That is, I find, the best way to deal with bullies.
And I do that in my adult life now, but I'm learning how to set boundaries, thanks to my therapist. So I'm trying to do that a little bit more gentle to myself instead of putting myself in harm's way, whether that be emotionally, physically, mentally. I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to still do that and have that about myself, but kind of make that safety net as well now.
Yeah.
Because when I was a kid, I was like, I don't care, punch me in the face. And I'm like, now I'm like, maybe don't. No.
Yeah, no, don't punch me in the face. I'll call the police.
Right. So it's definitely that.
Yeah. How about you, Andrew? That kind of rhymed. How about you, Andrew?
Growing up, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I'm a little bit larger and just like as a person, broad, tall, all directions. So I actually didn't have a lot of problems with bullies themselves, but I did have a lot of problems with like instances of bullying. So like I never had like a regular bully that would bully me constantly.
Same.
But like there would be like occurrences like an occurrence similar to yours where somebody said that they were going to punch me on the bus and I was like, okay, do it. And they laughed about it for a few minutes and then they left me alone. Or like one time a kid like made fun of my shirt while I was walking away and I turned around and I was large. And so he was like, oh, I'm sorry.
I had something like that in middle school.
Yeah. But like the bullying that always hit me the most was like bullying from friends. Like something that still sticks with me to this day was in preschool one day. Preschool ends much earlier than normal school, usually around lunchtime. And so a lot of kids, if like their parent wasn't ready to pick them up immediately or if they just wanted to hang out, they would eat lunch at school before going home. And so it was sort of free form. There wasn't like a schedule or anything. So kids would just sit together and eat lunch. And so I went to sit next to who was my best friend at the time. And pretty much as soon as I sat down, he stood up and went and sat somewhere else. And I was like, that's weird. But he didn't say anything, so I stood up and I went and sat next to him again because he was my best friend. We hung out every single day. And then he stood up and went and sat somewhere else again. So I was upset and I was a child, so I started to cry. And he was essentially like, I don't want to sit next to him. And I just like, I can't even remember, like the teacher eventually made him sit next to me, which was probably not the thing to do.
That's old school teaching.
But like, I don't remember even really hanging out with him after that, but it was so long ago, like I doubt it was the end immediately, but it was essentially the start of the end of that friendship. And like I said, it sticks with me today. I can still remember how I felt when that happened. Yeah. And so, yeah.
I will say I didn't have a regular bully either, except for some family members.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Isn't that interesting?
That are still bullies to me to this day. So
yeah.
I never had like in school, like you said, like I've never had like a one person that I would go back in time and be like, God, I would punch you in your face. Like I don't have that about a person that's not related to me.
Yeah.
That's kind of crazy.
When I think about a textbook bully experience, mine was in middle school in gym, and we had to change clothes, and you had to dress out is what we called it.
Yes, Jim.
And so I would, like, at the end of gym class, I would put because we all had lockers, so I would put my, like, gym clothes as I was changing. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I would put my clothes basically on the bench behind me and, like, change. And there was a guy who was next to me who was a year older than me, and I never saw him do it, but I noticed that my clothes kept on ending up on the ground, like, consistently. Mm-hmm. And finally I realized, and I was because I was always a very sweet, nice boy. Like I was a good boy,
Oh, you're still a good boy.
I was just like a nice, sweet boy. And so it didn't even occur to me, this guy's being a jerk, Right. And then when I realized it, I finally, I looked at him and I picked up my stuff and I put it back on the bench and I like had a look and held up my look at him. And then he took my stuff and shoved it off. It was like, your stuff goes on the ground. And I remember him being bigger than me and feeling afraid, but also I don't think he was bigger than me because I was so much taller than I thought I was. Yeah. Like I've been 6'3" since I was like in 6th grade, Yeah. So I didn't know how tall I was and how big I seemed. But I do remember the feeling of like, okay, what do we do here?
Yeah.
What do we do here? And I remember just standing up to him and being like, and picking my stuff back up and putting it on the and I can't even remember what I said or something along the lines of like, you're not going to do that anymore. Like, and just standing up and just being like, no, if you want to make this a thing, then we'll make it a thing.
Yeah.
You know, and I remember him backing down, and it was never a problem.
Yeah.
And he never was like, oh, sorry, sir. You know, he was never like that.
Sorry, grown man in 6th grade.
Yeah, it was just like, you know, it was kind of like that
Like spiteful.
feel.
No.
And then it was never a problem ever again. And there's something about that, just like, for me, I remember the feeling of like, this could end up with a split lip. Like, this could end up with a black eye.
Yeah.
And kind of having to choose how do I want to live? Do I want to live just kowtowing, or do I want to pay the consequences for standing up? And that's exactly what we're going to be reading about. Now, here's the one thing I will say. What we're going to read is actually like a children's story.
Okay.
Chapter 3 is a children's story, and you'll hear it in the repetition. So I'm going to try and read it as best I can like it's a children's story.
Cool.
And it's about standing up to a bully. And it's a children's story so that kids can learn, and particularly from an angle of faith, kids can learn what you do when somebody is telling you to be something you're not. When somebody's demanding that you be ashamed of who you are or change what you are, this is a children's story to teach kids this is how you handle it. A quick reminder that we are raising money for Residing Hope, formerly known as the United Methodist Children's Home. They focus on a lot of things, but primarily what they do is foster care. And they are currently raising money for their back to school drive. Every cent that you give to this channel via the Venmo or the links in the description down below will go directly to that cause. And we're funded by an investment fund, so none of it goes to my salary or anything like that. It goes directly to helping children. Consider giving and give generously, please. So we are reading from the book of Daniel, chapter 3, the story of, wake up. Story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it sounds like this. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon who destroyed the temple, conquered Israel, and brought Israelites into his own court. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Israelites who have been deported, and they've been kind of like confiscated by the king. Okay. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits, whose width was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. The king Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Can you hear that? Like, it's musical. It's normally this would have been told, not read, and so like part of the party trick is remembering all the lists of things. So anyway, that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." And I like to pretend that the children would say blazing fire after you say furnace.
Yeah, for sure.
Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped at the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship at the golden statue, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted.
There's the thumbnail.
Children's story. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" They answered the king, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. The 4th has the appearance of a god." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out! Come here!" So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel to deliver his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies, rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb." He didn't exactly learn his lesson.
He almost.
"And their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon, and they all lived happily ever after. So, one, you can hear the childishness of the story.
Yeah.
You can hear the rhythm of it. But also, like most childish stories, there's a kernel of really important morality and truth in it. So I mean, what do you make of this? What do you think the moral of the story is here? And there's no real wrong answers because this is an interpretive question. They get thrown in, they get demanded that they will worship this statue, and they said, "We can't do it. Our God doesn't allow that, and our God may deliver us or may not, but whatever happens, we're not worshiping." And then, because it's a children's story, of course God rescues them. That doesn't always go that way in real life. Of course we know that. But it's also a children's story. Like, this is part of it. It has to have a happy ending, Otherwise the kids won't go to bed.
Right.
But what do you make of that? How do we extrapolate a moral from that actually applies to adult faith?
I think for me it was screaming, "Live your truth," and maybe not even like stand up for what you believe in, but maybe not even that serious. Like, it just is like live as yourself.
Yeah.
Like, live authentically was what I was gaining from that.
Me too. I have a very similar feel from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also, there's also just the I don't know, more obvious, I guess, aspect of just like, hey, our God's the true God. Like, don't betray our God for other gods just because you're afraid of what'll happen to your mortal body, like that kind of thing, which, you know, is present in other
that's definitely a
stories
thing. Well, and so, because I think that's the very simple kind of like, that's what would get into a child's heart, you know, stand up for what we stand for, you know? But then as adults, I think it does beg this deeper question, which you kind of addressed. It's like, so what is the nature of standing up for what we believe in? And what is the nature of God and our calling as disciples who follow God? And I think there is something to definitely a big part of that is to live your truth, to be the person you were created to be. I think the other part I would add to that comes from the story is do it humbly.
Yeah.
Because I've read this story many, many, many times. I've read it out loud many times. I'm always struck by the, hey, you know what? If God saves us, that'd be great. If not, so be it.
Yeah.
And like that, I think, is the essence of true faith and true courage.
Yeah.
And there's a humility there. You can almost hear them say, hey, we might be wrong, so be it. And I think, so full confession, pretty much everyone on this couch is a left-leaning person. You know, I wouldn't say like woke agenda, but certainly progressive, because I actually hate woke agenda stuff. But certainly progressive, certainly for when I say people living their truth, the things that spring to my heart and mind are things like queer, things like nerd, you know, things like outcasts and people who have generally been excluded from society, anything racial, like those are the things that lift up in my heart. I also I can see how a person, I have felt shouted down by the left sometimes. I've felt where I've gone like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on, I have a question here, and been called, you know, phobe and ist before.
Yeah.
So I can really see it from both sides, but I think there really is something to in this day and age, like it is so much easier to stay quiet in either of those places. If you're gay, keep it to yourself, you know?
Don't ask, don't tell.
Right. Yeah. And if you, and you know, likewise, if you've got questions about, you know, there were protests that happened over in the pandemic, the BLM protests, and I'm speaking specifically locally, and I had a bunch of questions about like, well, wait a minute, who are we supporting? Like, whose voice are we empowering?
Right.
Like, I'm actually interested in fewer dead black people, and I want to know who I'm voting for by showing up at this protest, and was a little bit shouted down, you know, like, so, and there is this temptation to just like, you know what? Let me just go along with what everyone else is doing.
Right.
You know, I'll just deny this thing about myself that's intrinsic to who I am. And that'll make everyone else comfortable, and then I won't have to deal with it. And like, there is something to that. And I think there's something in this story that says,
that's not what you're supposed to do.
Humbly accept the consequences for humbly being true to who you are and what you were made to be. And you could be wrong. And that's why we have a church. That's why we're in community. But also, let's face it, the church has betrayed that loving accountability for judgment and hatred far too often.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's what comes up for this. Like, how do we encourage people to be who they are and also lovingly... I'm saying a lot of concepts and a lot of things. What comes to mind without asking a very specific question? Does anything come to mind just as I'm talking about those things for you guys? Because I can keep going.
I think just in general, it's like, I think from the other side of it, it's like, yeah, people should be themselves and live humbly, but also if you are experiencing somebody that is trying to be themselves, even if you disagree with them or you don't like what they're doing, that doesn't mean you have the right to stop them.
That's right.
Take a minute.
That's the other communal
Talk
side.
about it.
That's
Unless
Communicate.
they're causing harm to themselves or others.
Yes.
With caveats of self-harm or
Yeah.
like, and that is
Because I do fully agree with you, but sometimes like I'm not gonna like let a pedophile be like, that's just who I am. But like that's
Right.
not okay. That's not okay.
and there has been a push like minor
Right.
attracted people because the
Right.
pedophile has such stigma. It's
Yeah,
like, you know what? I don't mind that stigma actually.
We're good with that. That's fine.
Yeah, I understand there's some things that are out of their control, but also
That doesn't mean you get to
we
do it.
prioritize harm to children
Right.
over what I should be able to do what I want. No, you shouldn't. Stop.
that's
It may
the
not be
line.
your fault that you have those feelings, but it is your fault if you act on them.
Yeah.
Right.
That's,
Yes, and we hold that
That's true
accountable.
for most things.
Well, and I like because the word harm is very important to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And that's where I always because there's a lot of concern these days in the church about, well, how do we measure sin? And how do we hold sin accountable? And it's like, well, I permit everyone who is genuinely engaged in discipleship to decide for themselves their own sin, and the only boundary I have is when it's harm. Yeah, when there's perfectly. So again, left-leaning people. It's perfectly acceptable to me for a person in a Bible study or in a discussion or whatever to say, when I read scripture, it seems to me that homosexuality is not compatible with God's will. That's the interpretation I've arrived at, and here's why. That's perfectly fine with me. What I won't tolerate is being like, you're gay? What do you do? How can you even be like? You stop that right now, or you get out.
Yeah,
like that's harmful. And so like I've always had that line of like I'm not saying hurt feelings. I'm saying harm.
Yeah.
When the minute you start oppressing, and this is why I think the bully lesson is so applicable. Mm-hmm. So like there's the lesson of how we stand up to bullies, but then I'm glad you brought this around because this is kind of the thing I wanted to land at too. How do we as Christians also not be the bullies? Like how do we allow people to disagree with us and still be kind and loving and remained in a Christian communal relationship? And like that's a thing that we have just utterly lost as the church.
Yeah.
Like we have become the bullies. We've become Nebuchadnezzar, who says you can't, if you don't bow down and worship the statue that I made, aka my interpretation of the Bible.
Right.
If you don't bow down and worship the statue I made, then you don't belong here. And it's like,
I also want to point out there's some similar imagery there too, because Nebuchadnezzar is like, you will burn in a blazing fire in a furnace. And the common Christian thing is if you don't do what I say, you're going to burn in hell.
Right. Yeah.
I was thinking witches. Sorry. I was
have you been watching Star Wars? Have you been watching The Acolyte?
My total bad. I was like,
No.
you're talking about burning witches right now?
Hell is the threat.
Right.
And also the very real threat of, and you don't belong here.
Yeah.
You can't come to worship anymore. Get out of our Bible study. And I'll be frank. I have experience. I'm like as advantaged as like I'm white, straight, male, like cis. Like I'm just like the world is my oyster. You know what I mean? Like came from upper middle class family. Not to say I haven't had my struggles, but even saying that, I've been at Bible studies where I have asked questions, and I literally mean asked questions. I remember being at a Bible study where I was like, because I was going through something, and I thought this was a safe place, and I basically said, well, I'm really struggling with what we believe about God is that God is there, has the ability to intervene, knows what's happening, and still allows a child to be abused. I'm really struggling with that.
Yeah.
And, this was in my 20s. And that Bible study like shouted me down and did not want me back. And I was like,
that's crazy.
Yeah. It's like, so like Christians have taken bullying to, they've just like perfected the art, like it's just like
They're
crazy.
Like now, actually.
Yeah. It's like crazy. We're supposed to be the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And yet we've become really, really good at it.
I think the biggest, you asked what we think we can do to like make that a little bit better. I think what we're doing here is so important because I've never been to a church that they're like, the Bible is your interpretation of the Bible. Like there are rules, you know, like there are standards.
In essentials, unity, and non-essentials, diversity.
Right. There are essentials of like, hey, don't kill people. And then it's like, okay, cool. Don't harm people. Okay, cool. But I think what you have done for me is made the Bible feel like not a scary authoritarian, like slap down. And it's much more of like, hey, you should like read this and actually like make out what it means to you. And I think that's what we've lost.
Yeah.
Because it's very
not
much
a
like,
rule
I'm
book.
listening to the pastor.
Yeah, it's not a rule book.
Right.
It's not a history book.
It's a storybook, mostly.
Right. So it's like, because I grew up very much like you listen to what your pastor says and you don't have to open your Bible, it's fine. Like that's very much how it was. And it led to a lot of chaos in my life and a lot of uncertainty in my life.
I would say it's led to a lot of chaos and uncertainty in the church
In general.
large. Yeah.
Because it was always confusing for me because it was like, don't put your pastors on a pedestal, but also you only listen, like if you don't believe my interpretation of the Bible, then you don't belong here. Right. So it's like, I don't understand how those two things coincide, like live together.
Right.
Because like if I'm not supposed to be like idolizing you as a person, why am I believing every single thing you say at face value?
Yeah, and why can't I disagree with you about things?
Right, and not be encouraged and be actually disencouraged to like do my own research and like things like that.
Right.
So like that's where it loses me, but I really think that's where we start is like little churches like us, just kind of being like, hey. The Bible is your interpretation. It's not a rule book. It's not an authoritarian parent.
And
it's not.
You should read it, and you should read it humbly.
Yeah.
But you should arrive at your own conclusions, and then you should present those conclusions to a community that you can trust that will not harm you for disagreeing with them. Like God, it sounds like so revolutionary, but like read Acts chapter 2. This is where we started, folks. Like this is like we got together.
Like mic drop.
Yeah, right.
Like, come on, guys.
We got together, we had dinner, and we talked about what we believed in, and there were certainly like early clashes and disagreements and power struggles in the early church. Like I'm not going to pretend that wasn't there, but like church at its purest form is, all right, we all agree that Jesus is Lord and that's the best way, that's the best like personification of God's will on earth. That's where our starting place is. Okay, now, how do we do that? I'm like, well, what if we sold all our stuff? It's like, you can't sell all your stuff. And it's like, it's like,
right.
and then it was talking over a meal and
That's
like
how you grow
praying together.
an
That's how you grow
right?
any community in general, I feel like.
Yes.
But I feel like once Christians started weaponizing the Bible and weaponizing sin, I feel like that's when it really
money and power
took
are
a toll.
strong temptations. Money and power are very strong temptations.
And they infect everything they touch.
Yeah, and that's why the humbly part is so very important. So, and also thank you. It warms my heart to hear you say that. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because that is the absolute essence and heart of my calling and
this church in general,
what we're
I feel
about.
like,
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly. So, all right, we've gone over time as always. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
them.
Amen.
Oh, woman. That was for Hannah.
Yeah.